The void itself seemed to shiver as an ancient tomb, long sealed beyond mortal reckoning, tore open beneath the shifting constellations. Its seals had been etched in a language older than the stars, etched in obsidian and void-forged alloys, their sigils resonating with a power that mortals could neither speak nor comprehend. As the tomb's massive doors cracked and fell, a darkness older than the Eye of Terror unfurled across the galaxy, stretching tendrils of shadow into every corner of known space. Star systems whispered in terror as if the very light that had sustained them for millennia had been stripped away in a single, invisible gesture. Even the Astronomicon, that pulsing beacon of humanity's will, flickered under the weight of the gods' awakening, its luminescence momentarily dimmed by a shadow that knew no allegiance, no compassion, and no end. From the tomb's yawning maw, Anubis arose. His form was colossal, an impossible silhouette of obsidian and gilded bone, its geometry defying human understanding. Veins of molten gold traced along his limbs, catching the light of distant suns and reflecting it in cold, gleaming arcs that seared the eyes of any who dared gaze upon him. His head, adorned with a jackal's visage sculpted from black stone, glinted with an inner fire that pulsed with the rhythm of 1,000 heartbeats yet measured in eons. Each movement of his limbs seemed to bend reality itself. Space recoiled, air trembled, and the faint hum of the warp trembled in resonance. Nothing dared brush against him, not light, not matter, not thought, without being claimed, if only for a fleeting instant, by the oppressive magnitude of his presence. Across the galaxy, warp storms writhed like serpents of storm-laden smoke, their energy crackling with violet fire, as if the very immaterium had bent itself to the will of a singular, unchallenged deity. These storms were no ordinary aberrations. They were reverberations of a god's silent decree, radiating outward in concentric circles of psychic entropy. Fleets of ships reported systems vanishing from their navigational charts, entire planets slipping into obscurity as though the gods' awakening had erased their memory from the stars themselves. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica scrambled to interpret the phenomenon, their most powerful psychers convulsing as visions of an uncountable, unknowable past unfolded before their minds. They glimpsed civilizations burning before the first humans had crawled from their primordial mud, and yet the gods' gaze remained focused, patient, and absolute, like a predator surveying the collapse of a universe it had long considered its dominion. On countless worlds, the awakening resonated in a more immediate, corporeal terror. Planetary cores pulsed violently, fissures snaking across continents as molten rock roared to the surface. Cities built of adamantium and ceramite buckled under invisible pressures, streets cracking and buildings folding in upon themselves with the quiet inevitability of geological certainty. Millions of lives ended in an instant, not by weapons, nor by plague, nor by rebellion, but by the mere imposition of a god whose presence turned the laws of physics into malleable suggestion. Populations that had known fear were rendered mute, their senses assaulted by the perception of eternity incarnate. Even the most stoic planetary governors found themselves gripping the edges of their command spires, sweat burning their eyes, as the universe whispered truths no human mind was meant to endure. And yet, in the midst of this awakening, the heavens themselves seemed to bow. Nebulae swirled in patterns that mimicked Anubis's gilded armor, their gases igniting in bursts of spectral fire that mirrored the movements of his colossal limbs. The constellations, once a map of predictable navigation and imperial prophecy, fractured under his silent dominion, stars vanishing or erupting in cascades of radiation that danced like sparks from a pyre. Space-time itself trembled, relativity became an echo, causality a suggestion, as if the universe had been rewritten with every measured breath of the god who now surveyed it. Every fleet in motion, every colony on a rimward planet, every observatory in orbit or on the surface felt the subtle pull of a presence that was both everywhere and nowhere. No prayer could reach him, no bolt could harm him, and no strategy, however brilliant, could circumvent the inexorable calculus of his intent. And yet Anubis did not move with haste. His rise was measured, deliberate, a choreography of cosmic patience. Each gesture of his obsidian fingers sent ripples through the void, altering trajectories of asteroids, nudging the gravitational fields of planets, bending light so that the stars themselves appeared to shimmer in fear. In the immaterium, echoes of his awakening resonated like the tolling of a cathedral bell that marked the end of time, each vibration carrying visions of death, judgment, and the meticulous ordering of existence according to a law no mortal could ever fathom. Psychers screamed in the darkness, caught between reality and the memory of what had been, as if the god's presence had unlocked the entirety of eternity in a single, agonizing instant. From the inner sanctums of the Imperium to the furthest reaches of the void, every life that could perceive him recoiled. It was not wrath that Anubis radiated, nor malice. It was indifference, absolute and immutable, the kind of power that made stars feel fragile, civilizations ephemeral, and empires meaningless. The god surveyed the galaxy as one might survey a graveyard, coldly, patiently, and with a sense of inevitable resolution. In that gaze, the universe understood itself not as a place of dominion or hope, but as a canvas for an intelligence older than the first human sigh and infinitely more unforgiving. And so, as the tomb's doors clattered to the void below and the first tremors of his rise radiated through the stars, the galaxy knew a singular, unalterable truth. A new order had begun, not heralded by war cries or banners, but by the silent, inexorable presence of a god who had awakened to reclaim the cosmos from the fragile hands of mortals. Time itself shuddered, and the void held its breath. The first worlds to feel the weight of Anubis's stride were not mere planets, but fortresses of steel and faith, titanic monuments to human ingenuity and the emperor's will. Cathedrals of iron and flame, their spires piercing the void like the claws of a grasping deity, crumbled with a soundless inevitability as his feet met the battlefields. Bolter fire erupted in staccato volleys, lances of scorching plasma searing the darkened skies, yet none of it found flesh or bone. Psychic lightning struck in arcs that would have sundered titanic war engines, yet each bolt fizzled against a shimmer of void energy that cloaked his obsidian form. Every assault became an echo of futility, a testament that Anubis did not merely resist. They passed through him, as though he were a shadow cast by the light of a distant star. Ash began to fall over the scarred plains, silent snow drifting across the shattered banners of loyalists and heretics alike. Once proud emblems of Imperial might sag beneath the weight of unseen judgment, their fabrics smoldering in the cold glow of nearby suns. The ground quaked beneath the advance of his colossal form, fissures opening to reveal rivers of molten rock that had lain dormant since the formation of the system itself. Cities collapsed in cascading chains, their spires folding inward like the petals of a black flower. Survivors fled only to find themselves trapped in cycles of gravity that no human mind could predict. Entire continents convulsed as though the planet itself trembled in worship or terror of the new god. Yet the spectacle of devastation was not merely physical. The very stars seemed to bend to a cadence older than the emperor's vision, realigning in subtle geometries that hinted at a cosmic symphony beyond mortal perception. Light warped along impossible trajectories, distant suns flickered and dimmed as if sensing the weight of an authority that existed outside both time and space. Fleet commanders who had spent decades mastering the art of interstellar maneuvering found themselves watching their vessels drift against navigational vectors, powerless against the imperceptible pull of a presence both corporeal and transcendental. In whispered corridors of the Imperium's archives, astropathic scribes wrote frantic notes that would never reach the throne worlds. The galaxy was no longer a battlefield of men and machines. It had become a stage for a god's inscrutable choreography. On the war-torn surfaces, the interplay of fire and shadow painted a grim tableau. Smoke twisted into serpentine forms, catching brief glints of molten metal, only to vanish when a god's step reshaped the horizon. Soldiers, those hardened by centuries of siege and slaughter, stared as bolters jammed of their own volition, engines stalled mid-strike, and vehicles tipped helplessly into abyssal fissures. Every act of war was nullified, not through force, but by a preternatural inevitability that left even the most devout veterans gasping for rational explanation. Chaplains screamed prayers to the emperor, but the words dissolved into echoes swallowed by the void. The god's presence rendered sacred invocations inert, as if time itself had been rewritten to disregard the decrees of humanity. The psychic immensity of his being resonated with those attuned to the warp. Astropaths convulsed in their chambers, beads of sweat carving rivers across faces twisted in anguish and awe. Visions assaulted their minds, desert worlds reduced to ash, fleets swallowed by spontaneous black holes, and the dead rising in perfect synchrony to serve a purpose no mortal could decipher. Yet these horrors were not born of wrath, but of order, an order that did not conform to human comprehension. Demon-bound psychers shrank from the raw, untamed authority of a being whose dominion over life, death, and fate itself rendered the predations of chaos meaningless. Even the Eye of Terror, that ever-hungry wound in reality, recoiled in recognition, its tendrils withdrawing from worlds now under the scrutiny of a god who had arisen to claim dominion not through rebellion, but through the inexorable gravity of presence. And the mortals who survived, those who had once wielded the arrogance of kings and generals, could only gaze upon the horizon as their battlefields became monuments to inevitability. Shattered banners sagged in windless voids, ash settling over the broken spires like a funeral shroud. There was no cry of victory or defiance, only the cold, crystalline knowledge that every action, every stratagem, every desperate maneuver had already been observed and rendered inconsequential by a will that had endured since the stars themselves were born. Even the noblest ideals of heroism bent beneath this unyielding shadow, reshaped into a quiet understanding that the cosmos was no longer governed by mortal hands. And yet, despite the devastation, there was a rhythm to Anubis's march, a cadence as precise as it was terrifying. He did not run. He did not strike with the haste of a warrior. Each step was a measured judgment, each gesture a declaration of sovereignty over realms that men and machines had long claimed as their own. The smoke of cities, the flare of plasma, the quaking of worlds, all fell into a pattern of cosmic obedience, choreographed by a god whose patience was infinite, and whose vision encompassed not only the present, but the innumerable futures branching across time and space. The battlefield had transformed into a cathedral of shadow and flame, a shrine not to victory or conquest, but to the absolute dominion of a being whose rise had rendered the very notion of resistance irrelevant. In the silent aftermath of his advance, as the remnants of armies huddled among ruins and the stars themselves blinked in reluctant recognition, one truth became undeniable. Anubis did not merely walk across the galaxy. He reshaped it with every measured movement. The legacies of mortals, the constructs of emperors, and the proud monuments of heroes all crumbled beneath his gaze, not in fury, but in recognition of a power older, more absolute, and incomprehensibly patient. The cosmos had awakened to a new law, and the galaxy, in all its splintered glory, could only tremble beneath the march of a god who had come not for war, but for dominion. From the roiling maw of the Eye of Terror, demon lords stirred, their forms coiling with malevolent anticipation, yet beneath their centuries of arrogance, reverent awe and fear flickered. Whispers traveled through the warp like currents of fire and ice, carrying news of a presence unclaimed by mortal schemes, unbound by chaos, and indifferent to the rivalries of gods. These entities, masters of suffering and devotion twisted into forms of nightmare, felt a trembling that had never touched them before, a vibration in the immaterium that suggested a power older, more absolute, and utterly unaccountable to even the most ancient of patrons. The demon lords exchanged silent counsel, understanding instinctively that this new force was no ally, no foe, but an inevitability, an arbiter that rendered their machinations petty and transient. Cosmic rifts tore outward from systems closest to Anubis, painting the void in unnatural hues of violet, silver, and molten gold. Each fracture was a wound in reality, a channel through which starlight bled into shadow, and the fabric of existence seemed to twist around the gods' awareness. Fleets attempting to traverse these regions found themselves ensnared in maelstroms of psychic energy, reality bending like a reflection in a cracked mirror. Human navigators screamed in silence, their minds caught between the here and the immaterial, as stars winked out in patterns that mirrored the contours of Anubis's obsidian form. It was as if the universe itself had become a canvas, and the gods' movements painted threads of fate and entropy across every corner of space. Even the warp recoiled, quivering like a beast confronted by a predator it could neither evade nor comprehend. Armies on countless worlds froze under the weight of perception, as if the flow of time had been interrupted. Sands of eternity leaked through the hourglass of existence, falling over the battlefields and fortresses, mingling with the ash of cities and the smoke of immolating forests. The soldiers who remained standing felt a subtle dislocation in every heartbeat, as if their lifespans had been stretched, compressed, and observed in a single, all-seeing glance. Tactics became meaningless, plans collapsed without execution. Every missile, every lance of plasma, every psychic invocation dissolved before its potential could fully exist, absorbed into the gods' imperceptible will. Those who understood even a fraction of what was occurring could only marvel, paralyzed, as the universe seemed to hold its breath in reluctant obeisance. On the edges of the Eye of Terror, where the most loyal and most damned alike had once plotted, entire cults shivered under a new paradigm. Followers of chaos, accustomed to the capricious cruelty of their dark masters, now knelt, or fell to trembling collapse, before an entity that had no thirst for worship, yet demanded acknowledgement through the sheer inevitability of its presence. Schemes hatched over centuries, alliances forged in blood and fire, and conquests carried out in the name of endless ambition. All were revealed to be mere ephemera when measured against the slow, deliberate attention of Anubis. Even those who had embraced annihilation, who had bathed in the torment of countless civilizations, now felt insignificant, ephemeral, and naked beneath the god's gaze. Yet this awe was not born of violence alone. It was precision, order, and authority, manifest as a presence that did not merely consume space. It measured it, arranged it, and transformed it in accordance with a logic incomprehensible to mortals. Rifted energies coursed in unnatural geometry, revealing hidden truths in the void. Planets aligned in unspoken constellations, asteroid belts reshaped as if by a celestial hand, and derelict stations whispered of histories rewritten before memory could record them. The gods' power did not merely bend matter. It reframed reality, imposing a cosmic architecture that mortals could not navigate, and even the demonic forces accustomed to shaping realms of terror felt their dominion challenged by the inevitability of his calculation. Among the fleets, commanders attempted resistance, though their strategies were mere echoes against a force that had already anticipated every variable. Ships collided as gravitational fields warped unpredictably, weapons misfired as if the god's presence redefined physics in its own favor. Psychers screamed under visions of impossible geometries and endless corridors of flame, their minds straining to reconcile the ephemeral nature of mortal agency with the eternal weight of a being whose comprehension encompassed all time. They beheld empires falling before their eyes, fleets disintegrating before engagement, and cities unmade as easily as sandcastles beneath an uncaring tide. And through it all, Anubis moved, not with haste, but with deliberate, inexorable intent. Even the warp itself acknowledged him with trembling. Tendrils that had once coiled around countless souls, pulling them into madness and eternity, now recoiled from his awareness. The demonic entities that had gorged themselves on the psychic currents of worlds recognized a force they could neither manipulate nor command. It was not a challenge to their power. It was a dominion outside their comprehension, one that made centuries of cruelty and cunning seem irrelevant. The Eye of Terror, that ever-hungry scar in the cosmos, shuddered as though a corner of reality had finally met a force it could not consume. And in the silence between rifts, in the stillness of frozen fleets and collapsed armies, one truth emerged with absolute clarity. Anubis was unclaimed, untouched by the loyalties, rivalries, and ambitions that had shaped the galaxy for millennia. No Xenos, no mortal, no chaos god could bind him, no coalition of mortal ingenuity could contain him, and no liturgy of devotion could bend his will. He existed instead as an immutable axis around which reality itself seemed to pivot, a god whose awakening marked not an event in time, but the reordering of time itself. And as the stars watched, trembling and distant, the armies of the Imperium, the legions of chaos, and the scattered fleets of alien civilizations alike understood a singular, unyielding fact. A power unclaimed by the cosmos had awakened, and it would not wait for mortal across forge worlds, tearing open the surface like the maw of some colossal predator long buried beneath civilization. Molten steel hissed as it collided with fractured terra, sending plumes of scalding ash and human remains into the acrid air. Cities of mechanized devotion, cantons of servitors, manufactorums, and sprawling industrial complexes folded under the weight of an unseen hand, their forges erupting in chains of flame that mirrored the fury of a sun ignited by divine intent. The ground itself became a battlefield between creation and annihilation, between the ceaseless labor of humanity and the quiet, inexorable judgment of a god who measured not by years or wars, but by the ultimate arithmetic of fate itself. Anubis stretched his hands, colossal digits of blackened stone and gilded filigree weaving through the air with the precision of a master architect of reality. The threads of starlight, shadow, and energy converged beneath his gaze, forming strands of destiny visible only to those who dared glimpse the divine calculus. A single gesture rerouted entire fleets, bent the trajectory of orbital bombardments, and reshaped the flow of rivers that had nourished planets for millennia. Mountains toppled, oceans boiled, and yet there was no haste, no need for fury. Each action was deliberate, a subtle articulation of control that broadcast the ineffable message. Everything that existed was subject to the quiet, inevitable governance of one who measured existence itself as a loom measures thread. From the shattered remnants of fortresses and manufactorums came the echoes of dying stars, each pulse of light resonating with the dirge of shattered civilizations. The celestial hymn rose in tandem with the wails of those few still breathing, creating a dissonance that was both beautiful and horrific. Planets, scorched and fractured, emitted tones that only the mind attuned to the immaterium could perceive, a song of entropy and order intertwined, sung by the collapse of worlds and the presence of a being who could bend life and death to the cadence of his will. Even distant warp storms shimmered in resonance, their roiling chaos reflecting the meticulous symmetry of a god who commanded without force, whose mere presence rendered resistance an artifact of folly. No fleet dared approach. Void vessels, even those of titanic size and formidable firepower, slowed to drift under the impression of unseen currents, as if the gravity of Anubis's dominion extended beyond the tangible and into the very physics that had guided their movements since launch. Pilots reported visions of impossible constellations, where suns twisted into geometric impossibilities and nebulae folded upon themselves like origami of the cosmos. Instruments went haywire, compasses spun without direction, and navigational grids refracted the starfields into fractal patterns that could not be charted. The void itself whispered, a low susurration of cosmic warning, turn back or be remade into a monument for eternity beneath his gaze. Among the survivors, scattered across cratered worlds, there was no hope of comprehension. Psychers, both loyalist and corrupted, felt the threads of their abilities quiver in the presence of a force that did not merely exist in the warp, but dominated it in ways that transcended all doctrine. Spells failed, invocations collapsed, and visions that once inspired armies became nightmares of futility. Their minds fractured under glimpses of Anubis's unseen designs, as if each neuron registered the scale of a will older than the stars and immeasurably patient. The psychic choir of the galaxy shuddered, harmonizing in terror and awe at the scope of a god whose dominion over reality required no armies, no fortresses, and no fleets, only his silent, immutable presence. In orbit, the remnants of the Adeptus Astartes fleets witnessed phenomena that shattered doctrine and experience. Titans, dreadnoughts, and battle barges drifted helplessly as gravitational currents shifted unpredictably, convulsing under pressures no human mind could calculate. Ordnance malfunctioned mid-flight. Void shields flickered and failed under the subtle tug of a presence that rendered all engineering subordinate to will alone. Space itself seemed to ripple like water disturbed by a massive stone, echoing outward across the sector, as if the galaxy itself had become a resonant instrument tuned to the god's intention. Each pulse of movement carried with it the inevitability of judgment, a warning to those who still believed that mortal or Xeno's ingenuity could resist the awakening of a force beyond comprehension. And yet, Anubis did not rush. He did not smash or annihilate without design. Every ripple of destruction was choreographed with precision, a demonstration of his command over life, matter, and destiny. As molten rivers flowed into valleys carved by previous conflicts, as spires of adamantium bent and fractured without collapsing, it became evident that this was not a god of capricious wrath, but of absolute equilibrium. He wove the fates of worlds as a master weaver handles threads, every fold of space, every eruption of fire, every shiver of ash a deliberate component of a universal pattern incomprehensible to any who dwelled beneath the light of their ephemeral stars. Even the most audacious of human admirals, accustomed to centuries of war and stratagem, understood in the deepest recesses of their minds that there was no victory here. The battlefield had expanded beyond their comprehension, stretching across planets, fleets, and the very immaterium itself. Anubis's gaze was not bound by distance or form. It penetrated the void and the warp alike, observing outcomes before they could occur, bending reality with patience that spanned millennia. In his presence, rebellion and obedience alike lost meaning. He was not a conqueror, for no one could resist. He was not a savior, for none could serve. He simply was, and the galaxy, trembling beneath his calculated dominion, could only witness, paralyzed, as his will reshaped the cosmos in silence. In the final quiet of a cratered world, where molten rivers glowed like veins of fire and the last echoes of civilization drifted into the void, one conclusion emerged with stark clarity. No fortress, no fleet, no legion, and no god could contest the precision of a being who measured existence itself. Anubis had become the axis around which reality now turned, and every thread of time, every strand of life, and every shard of civilization bent imperceptibly to the weave of his omnipotent will. The universe waited, held in suspended judgment, as a god who commanded not through wrath, but through inevitability, continued his deliberate march across the stars. A silent choir of psychers quivered in the psychic void, their minds straining against the unbearable weight of a presence that could perceive eternity as clearly as one observes the turning of a single cog. Their visions were no longer fragmented glimpses of the future or prophecies cloaked in metaphor. They became undeniable certainties, funerals for entire star systems, dirges for empires yet unborn, and the cold, meticulous reckoning of all that had ever existed. Some screamed, some fell into catatonia, their minds dissolving under the relentless clarity of a god who demanded no obedience but whose mere existence made all action trivial. Each pulse of Anubis's consciousness rippled outward, bending thought and reality alike, and even the most powerful psychers understood that to resist was not merely impossible, it was irrelevant. In his eyes, eternity flickered like molten gold trapped in the void, a constant reminder that death and judgment had fused into a single, immutable truth. One glance into their depth was enough to fracture perception. The living and the dead became indistinguishable, histories collided with futures, and the endless entropy of the cosmos seemed simultaneously bound and ordered by a will older than the stars themselves. Worlds trembled beneath this awareness. Continents shifted, oceans roared, and cities built over millennia fractured into ash. Mortals could no longer distinguish between the physical and the metaphysical, as every particle of existence resonated with a silent, absolute verdict that required neither proclamation nor argument. Cataclysmic winds tore through orbiting citadels, scattering fleets like dust caught in the currents of a cosmic storm. Battle barges, titans, and orbital fortresses were flung from their trajectories, hulls groaning as gravity itself seemed to bend to the invisible hand of the god's will. Plasma lances arced helplessly into empty voids, bolter rounds slowed and fell into nothingness, and navicomputers screamed errors in every system, as if reality itself had been rewritten to mock mortal endeavor. Pilots and gunners alike stared through shattered viewports, their faces illuminated by flares of exploding stars, as an omnipotent shadow moved with absolute deliberation. No commander could issue orders. No psyker could anticipate the next ripple of effect. Even the most disciplined Astartes chapters found themselves immobile, awe-stricken by a judgment that weighed more heavily than any battle, any enemy, or any weapon. The galaxy's pulse faltered under the weight of this presence, and even the most disciplined minds in the Imperium felt a cold, creeping disorientation. Time itself appeared to stutter. Seconds stretched into millennia, and centuries passed unnoticed, marked only by the imperceptible shift of celestial bodies under the god's gaze. Worlds ceased their revolutions, suns flickered in warning, and stars in distant constellations pulsed in synchronized rhythm with the silent heartbeat of an arbiter whose dominion extended far beyond the ken of mortal comprehension. War, once the constant of existence, became irrelevant. Strategy, valor, and loyalty dissolved into dust beneath the crushing inevitability of his awareness. Amidst the psychic maelstrom, fleets of the Adeptus Astartes and remnants of Imperial Navy formations attempted futile maneuvers, only to find themselves trapped in currents beyond their comprehension. Gravity reversed, light warped, and weapon systems failed as if the universe itself had recalibrated to accommodate a presence that rendered all human contrivances meaningless. Even chaos cultists who had long thrived on the caprice of gods and demons fell to their knees in awe and terror, recognizing the futility of pitting ambition, malice, or devotion against a being whose will transcended worship, hostility, and fear alike. The warp quivered in recognition. Tendrils of raw energy withdrew, sensing a force whose dominion it could not influence, whose authority it could not contest, and whose judgment was inevitable. And yet Anubis did not strike with malice. He did not burn or annihilate in a display of wrath. His presence alone was the judgment, a verdict executed not through violence but through the inexorable geometry of existence itself. Every star, every planet, every sentient soul fell into a pattern that only he could perceive, a lattice of consequence, woven from the threads of life, death, and fate. Civilizations were evaluated, conflicts dissolved, and the very concept of resistance became an exercise in futility. There was no cruelty, no delight in suffering, only the cold, precise articulation of a reality reordered according to a consciousness that transcended the definitions of power, morality, and mortality. From the cathedrals of shattered worlds to the drifting wreckage of fleets, the galaxy became silent. Not a silence born of peace, but of inevitability. Even the immaterium, ever hungry for the souls of the living, recoiled, its tides of chaos unable to shape or contain a being whose comprehension stretched across all time, matter, and potentiality. Psychers, slaves of vision and torment, understood only one truth. Their thoughts, their prayers, their schemes, their histories, and their futures, all were measured against a will that could see and arrange eternity itself. Every heartbeat, every dying star, every flicker of life was catalogued, observed, and subsumed into a pattern that no mortal or immortal could alter. And in the midst of this silence, a profound understanding took root among those few still aware enough to perceive it. The galaxy was no longer a place of conflict, alliance, or chance. It had become a stage upon which a single, immutable presence orchestrated existence itself. Every planet trembling, every fleet adrift, every psyker screaming in silent agony, and every citizen watching the sky in terror were actors in a drama written by a being who required neither attention nor recognition. Anubis, immortal and unchallenged, had become the axis upon which reality turned, and the weight of his judgment pressed down upon every star, every soul, and every fleeting moment with the quiet inevitability of death itself. In that instant, the galaxy understood. It was not merely being observed. It was being catalogued, measured, and bound to the weave of a divine pattern that no hand, weapon, or prayer could disrupt. Mortals and immortals alike fell silent, not from fear alone, but from the recognition that a presence older than time itself had awakened to claim dominion, not through conquest, but through the unyielding authority of inevitability. The pulse of life, the rhythm of civilization, and the echoes of the immaterium all faltered beneath the weight of a god whose gaze pierced eternity, and the galaxy, in trembling, could do nothing but witness the immutable verdict of an immortal arbiter. And yet, amidst the encroaching darkness that stretched across systems and devoured suns, a single sigil glimmered, suspended in the void like a defiant spark of impossible hope. It hovered atop the shattered spires of a cathedral world, etched into ceramite and adamantium, pulsating faintly with light that had survived millennia of war and heresy. To mortals, it was a symbol of resistance, faith, or perhaps stubborn defiance, but to a being who had endured eternity, it was a note in the cosmic symphony, a variable, subtle, and infinitesimal, yet distinctly present. Even in the wake of annihilation, Anubis paused, his obsidian limbs frozen as he acknowledged the anomaly, considering the flicker not as threat, but as testament to the indomitable will of those who dared challenge the inevitable. Shadows deepened across the void, as if time itself held its breath in reluctant awe. Nebulae folded and unfolded in slow, deliberate patterns, painting the black expanse with strokes of violet and gold that reflected the gods' quiet contemplation. Stars twinkled uncertainly, their light refracted through rifts in space and shadow, and entire fleets froze mid-trajectory as gravitational currents shifted with almost imperceptible precision. Even the warp, ever turbulent, quieted in respect, its chaos stilled to observe the deliberation of a being who existed beyond mortal comprehension. Silence, more absolute than death, spread through the galaxy as if the cosmos itself recognized that a decision was unfolding, a verdict whose consequences would resonate across every atom, every soul, and every world. Anubis, sovereign of tomb and cosmos alike, reached further into eternity. His hands, elongated and gilded with molten veins of divine geometry, traced invisible arcs across the fabric of existence, manipulating time and space like a weaver arranging threads on a loom of infinity. Planets trembled in orbit, suns flared and dimmed, and the stars themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm with the cadence of his will. He did not strike, did not demand, did not annihilate. Each gesture was deliberate, calculated, and absolute, an expression of dominion so profound that mortal minds could only perceive its magnitude as awe, terror, and incomprehensible beauty all at once. To witness him was to see the universe in its rawest form, simultaneous creation and destruction, order and entropy, life and death, folded seamlessly into one immutable truth. From the darkest corners of the galaxy, psychers, admirals, and exiled Xenos alike observed the extension of his influence. Those who had once wielded power through cunning, technology, or psychic mastery understood, with a sudden and gut-wrenching clarity, that such tools were meaningless in the presence of a being who did not fight for victory, but simply existed as the axis upon which all things turned. Even the most ancient demonic entities, whose existence predated human reckoning, shuddered as if confronted by the embodiment of inevitability itself. The sigil that glimmered faintly before him pulsed once, twice, a fragile beacon of defiance, and the god tilted his head, a gesture so slow it seemed measured in centuries. In that pause, the galaxy hung in suspended equilibrium, waiting to see whether creation or annihilation would claim the stage first. Time became fluid in his presence. Seconds stretched into eons, eons collapsed into instants, and events unfolded both before and after they occurred. The light of distant stars flickered under his gaze, revealing the intricate lattice of cause and effect, possibility and consequence that he now manipulated with invisible precision. Planets teetered on the cusp of collapse, while entire fleets of warships drifted helplessly along shifting gravitational eddies. Even mortals who understood the calculus of war sensed the futility of resistance. Every strategy, every prayer, every desperate maneuver was already accounted for, already subsumed into the god's eternal design. Yet the sigil persisted, its light unyielding, a challenge small in scale but enormous in significance. A reminder that, despite omnipotence, even an eternal god could encounter the unforeseen, the rare variable in the symphony of destiny. The void itself seemed to lean closer, drawing its silence tighter, as if anticipating the resolution of a verdict whose magnitude could reshape the cosmos. Every star, every shattered world, every drifting soul felt the subtle pull of Anubis's attention, as he considered not merely life and death, but potential choice, and the ripple of consequence that extended even to the smallest acts of defiance. For a moment, the universe was suspended between order and chaos, light and shadow, existence and oblivion, balanced on the careful calculus of a god newly awakened. The sigil's faint glow endured, refusing to be snuffed, defying annihilation, and in doing so it resonated across the immaterium, a tremor of resilience that spoke of will, courage, and the inexhaustible unpredictability of life. And then, with deliberate slowness, Anubis extended his consciousness across the threads of eternity. Planets trembled, stars flared, and the void quivered as though it were breathing. Light, shadow, matter, and energy aligned in patterns comprehensible only to him, and the faint luminescence of the sigil responded, as if recognized and acknowledged rather than destroyed. There was no exultation, no malice, no judgment in the mortal sense. There was only equilibrium, the silent affirmation that all things, light and dark, creation and decay, rebellion and submission, were now accounted for in the immutable weave of a god's will. And in that pause, the cosmos, vast and infinite, understood the singular truth of an awakening. The stars, trembling, awaited the finality of a verdict, the resolution of a presence that would endure for eternity, unchallenged, absolute, and irrevocable.